desert back there, and he's heading this way.
My corns always hurt. They're near a monster.
Sheriff, what kind of fantastic trees have you got growing around here?
1, 2, 3.
Right on.
It's a land that God, if he exists, has created in anger.
That's a bad outfit.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of Geeking Out with Galaxy Infinitum. Today we will be celebrating another film turning 45, coming out the same summer of Star Wars, summer of '77. It was the great stop-motion maestro Ray Harryhausen's penultimate film, Sinbad in the Eye of the Tiger, which came out August 12th of that summer. It was the third and final film in Ray Harryhausen's Sinbad trilogy. And although it was a success at the box office, making $20 million on a $3.5 million budget, which actually was at that time Ray Harryhausen's biggest budgeted film, which would be eclipsed by his final film a few years later in Clash of the Titans. But so it was a successful film at the box office, but it certainly was no Star Wars, having come out in the same summer. But it nonetheless had a seismic impact on 8-year-old me, because it was this film, Sinbad in the Eye of the Tiger, along with this cover article about the film and the making of it in Cinefantastic magazine that came out that summer, that turned the light bulb on over my head and made me realize I could make movies. And it led to the creation of my very first film, with help from my sister Jennifer, my buddy John, and the gracious donation of my mom's kitchen table as our stop-motion animation studio. Which we took up space on for weeks on end, finishing the movie. So here, for your entertainment and edification, a little brief glimpse of my first movie, The Battle. Pretty cool, huh? Such was the little acorn that would grow into the mighty oak of Galaxy Infinitum Studios. Now that little movie was shot with a camera almost exactly like this one. Not this one, in fact. This one we got at Goodwill, it's still got the sticker on it. Goodwill a few years ago, but it's almost the exact same model, a little Kodak Instamatic. The only difference is that the one that I used had a little round zoom knob so it could zoom in and out, and this one does not have it. That original camera, by the way, was destroyed in the Wichita Mountains when I was about 15. I was gallivanting around Mount Roosevelt with a couple of buds with the camera filming stuff, and it dropped it down the side of Mount Roosevelt and tumbled several hundred feet down cliffs and boulders. We mounted a rescue operation and did in fact retrieve the broken, shattered pieces of the camera, which I've got in a bag somewhere, and more importantly, the precious cartridge of Super 8 film, which I held on to for some unremembered period of time until my dad one day came home with a new Super 8 camera for me. So I promptly popped the cartridge in, started shooting with the new roll, and amazingly enough, the film all came out. The stuff we'd shot before the camera broke, and the new stuff with the new camera, which was actually a better camera and than this old one, this old Instamatic. And there's only just a brief white flash where there were maybe about 4 frames in the gate that were exposed when the cartridge popped out of the camera when it broke. It was lucky that I myself didn't perish along with the camera on the mountain that day. Now it's interesting, this camera did not have a single frame setting so that you could just press it and take a single frame, which is essential for doing stop motion animation. So I learned from these magazines right here. Take a look, Cinemagic magazine. But this was a magazine that was an offshoot of Starlog Publications that gave you tips on how to make your own Super 8 movies. And one of the tips was if you had a camera that didn't have a single frame setting, you could just kind of trip the shutter like this, and it would just expose a couple of frames. You probably couldn't get just a single frame, but if you did it quick enough, it would be just a couple of frames. So that's what I did. Now it's got a screw attachment for a tripod, but we did not have a tripod, so a still camera is essential in stop motion. So what I did, so I got this. My dad had this rolling metal file cabinet that I set the camera on top of in front of the kitchen table. That was our diorama tabletop, and I braced it with a bunch of paperback books on either side so it wouldn't move. And then when I would get ready to trip the frames, I would press it down real hard and then trip it gently, hoping it wouldn't jostle the camera too much. And at the same time, I had no idea how much footage I was exposing, if any footage I was exposing. I could tell something was happening because the counter slowly moved over time. Now, we took us weeks to finish this movie. And at the same time, we also didn't have any lights. So we just opened the drapes in the kitchen on the big patio door and just used sunlight to light it. And of course, as the hours went by, we could just shoot during the day. The sun would move across the sky, the clouds would flit by, and the light would change. But I actually was amazed when I got the film back and developed it, because I had no idea what would actually be on it. It actually looked pretty good. And luckily, the wall behind the table was painted blue, so that served as a sky. And the effect of the clouds flitting, the light from the clouds and the sun moving across that wall actually kind of looked to me like clouds moving by. So it actually I thought was a cool effect. But anyway, that was how I did my first stop motion animation movie. Inspired, of course, by Ray Harryhausen, Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger, and this article in Cinefantastique, which was interviewed Ray and gave an in-depth explanation of his Dinorama process, which was the process he used for stop motion animation, and thus inspired me to make my own film. Anywho, summer '77 was a momentous one for me, with the 1-2 punch of Star Wars and Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger. Now, I was already a huge fan of Ray Harryhausen, was very familiar with his work, and knew the rudiments of what stop motion animation was and how it worked, and had seen nearly all of his movies at that point on TV. And of course, I also knew about Ray's mentor, the great Willis O'Brien, who pioneered the process in The Lost World, and then in King Kong, which was another one of my favorites. But Ray's films, I loved even more. His Dinosaurs versus Cowboys epic, Valley of Gwangi, blew my mind when my mom dragged me out of bed one school night and plopped me down in front of the TV, shook me awake, pointed my head at the TV and said, "Mike, dinosaurs!" And then I was, of course, glued to the set thereafter. And the next day in Mrs. Smith's first grade class, I kept falling asleep. And Mrs. Smith, being the good teacher that she was, said, "Mike, why are you falling asleep?" And I helpfully explained, "Oh, my mom got me out of bed to watch a dinosaur movie." Well, Mrs. Smith wasn't too pleased about that. But the much more important experience was seeing that film, which is still one of my favorites. But perhaps my favorite Ray Harryhausen film was The Glorious Seventh Voyage of Sinbad. Still to this day, one of the greatest fantasy adventure films of them all. A lot of Ray Harryhausen fans pick Jason the Argonauts as their favorite. And it's a great film too, but for me, my favorites are Valley of Gwangi and Seventh Voyage of Sinbad. But in spite of being such a fan and having seen almost all of his movies already on TV, especially on Channel 7's Shock Theater on Saturday nights, 10:15. But in spite of all that, I had not actually seen a Ray Harryhausen film in a, for real, movie theater.
These eyes peer out through time, through space, to a land beyond imagination. These are the eyes of the tiger.
So when 77 rolled around and Eye of the Tiger was coming out, I was very primed to go see that in the theater, which we did. Looking back on it now, though it didn't occur to me then when I was a little kid, that summer kind of represented a changing of the guard, with Star Wars coming out the first part of the summer and then Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger coming out in the later half of the summer. A lot of critics unfavorably compared Eye of the Tiger to the state-of-the-art Star Wars, finding Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger rather quaint and old-fashioned, with its very handmade special effects compared to the brand new, never-before-seen stuff in Star Wars. And, in all fairness, Eye of the Tiger is, a rather quaint, old-fashioned movie. Now, I don't think there's anything wrong with that in and of itself, but it did make a noticeable contrast at the time when they came out. But something else that's really interesting in that context is the fact that Star Wars, from Lucas on down, was made by folks that were heavily influenced by Ray Harryhausen. Lucas, himself later on, after Ray Harryhausen died, said that without Ray Harryhausen, there probably would not have been a Star Wars. And in fact, if you think about it, I kind of think Seventh Voyage of Sinbad kind of did sort of a lot of the same things that Star Wars did in its day, by being a movie that presented sights that had never before been seen on film, with a technical prowess and accomplishment that had never before been attempted. And it also revived a seemingly dead genre, the fantasy adventure, which everybody had written off as old hat. In fact, that's one of the reasons why Harryhausen and his producing partner, Charles Schneer, had such a hard time finding a home for Seventh Voyage. They had to shop it all around town before Columbia finally said okay, because everybody thought, man, nobody wants to see this stuff anymore. It's old-fashioned. But they reinvented that genre for a new generation, and it was a big hit. And in fact, influenced so many filmmakers. On Star Wars, of course, you had Lucas. You also had Phil Tippett. You had Dennis Muren, both of whom actually had visited Ray Harryhausen as teenagers, which Ray Harryhausen did a lot. He would invite fans out to his home studio, because he had his studio set up in his garage. That's where he did his work, and would show them around, and was very generous with his time and his knowledge in helping other effects artists get started. In fact, I also remember Dennis Muren talking specifically about, because one of the key images that so many people talk about, like Dennis Muren, Phil Tippett, Rick Baker, all these guys who are influenced, who are effects guys and influenced by Ray Harryhausen, talk about that seminal image of the Cyclops coming out of the cave as something that was just indelibly branded onto their brains. Dennis Muren told the story about how when he was hanging out in Ray's garage, he happened to look up and see the rotting puppet. In stop motion animation, they're called puppets. The actual miniatures, they have the mobile armature in them. They're not made of clay, as many people mistakenly think. They're actually, claymation is something else, where you actually take clay figures and animate them. The stop motion animation that Ray did had metal ball and socket skeletons that were covered with molded foam rubber that was based on a sculpt and then painted, very detailed, very lifelike. But yeah, that was sitting up on a shelf in the garage, and it was just rotting away with pieces and chunks falling off of it. And he thought it was a rather ignoble end to such a magnificent creature. Now, I would come to, in time, actually see that, what was left of that armature, and all the skin indeed was gone at that point. The only thing left was its tongue, which in a very famous shot in Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, Cyclops licks his lips with that tongue as he's roasting on a Sinbad's men on a spit. But more about that later. But yeah, it was such an influence on, Harryhausen was such an influence on so many filmmakers, Steven Spielberg, James Cameron, Guillermo del Toro, Peter Jackson, on and on and on and on. And so it's kind of interesting that you kind of had this moment where there was this changing of the guard between the old school Ray Harryhausen, who was a singular artist, worked on his own, almost entirely alone. And now you had this new style of fantasy film that was big budget, computer driven. Even though CGI wasn't around then, the effects were done with computer controlled models and things. So it really was kind of an interesting changing the guard right there in that summer. Hello, Sally. Do you want to be in the video? Something else that's really interesting about Ray Harryhausen is that he's practically alone amongst film technicians, and in this case specifically a special effects artist, in that he ultimately became the author of his films, following the auteur theory, the French auteur theory, which suggests that the director is the author of the film. Which is true most of the time, I think. I still am a believer in that theory. Ray was a case where somebody not the director became the author of the film, so especially by the time you hit Seven Voyages of Sinbad. The earlier films, he was kind of more just sort of like the guy doing the effects. But by the time of Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, he was instrumental in like the whole film, and picking the subject matter, crafting the story, designing the action and special effects sequences, doing all the storyboards, doing the production illustrations, designing the creatures and the monsters, sometimes even sculpting them. And he was also instrumental in, as time went on, in developing the script with the writer, in making casting decisions, picking out a director, influencing who would do the score. He had a great relationship with Bernard Herrmann for 4 movies. Bernard Herrmann is one of the great film composers of all time. I mean, he worked with Hitchcock a lot. He did Psycho, he did Vertigo. He's like one of the top film composers ever. And that was the kind of influence that Harryhausen had on his films. He was also on set and essentially directed all the effect sequences, because everything that happened on the physical locations with the live action had to match what he did later in stop motion. So Harryhausen was kind of unique in that position, where he actually was much more of an author of his films than many directors on other films. And unlike a lot of other artists and or special effects technicians or different people like that who kind of toil in obscurity and sort of die forgotten, which is very sad, kind of happened to Willis O'Brien, Harryhausen's mentor. Fortunately, that wasn't Ray Harryhausen's fate. He had a long and successful, storied career, made many, many successful movies, worked for decades, and after he retired after his last film, which was also his most commercially successful, Clash of the Titans, in '81, and he retired, he was able to really enjoy a long retirement in which he was, got to bask in the glow of adulation from fans and other professionals, winning a Lifetime Achievement Academy Award, getting to go around and do talks, and he was always really generous with his time and his appearances with fans. And it was one of the few times where the universe kind of got something right. Looking at it now, it is clear that Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger is the least of the 3 Sinbad films, but that doesn't make it bad or mean that it can't be enjoyed, because I certainly do enjoy it a lot. It's a bit sillier and campier than either of the 2 earlier Sinbad films or Ray's other earlier mythological film, Jason and the Argonauts. Both Seventh Voyage and Jason and the Argonauts are truly great fantasy films and must be ranked at the forefront of that genre. The second Sinbad film, The Golden Voyage of Sinbad, also is a terrific piece of work, and I feel it's one of Harryhausen's more underrated efforts and contains some of his most technically accomplished sequences. I think it marks a high point of the diorama process, where the animation and live action elements are most successfully blended and look the sharpest and most carefully integrated into a seamless whole. And there are some real standouts in the film, the fight with the 6-armed collie statue being the best, and I think it ranks as one of Harryhausen's great sequences. There is nothing as iconic as the Cyclops or the skeleton duels, but the work is top-notch. And the live action stuff is fun and appealing, with an engaged cast having a lot of fun. And photographically, it is a beautiful film. Seventh Voyage is the winner of the Sinbad Sweepstakes with its wonderful creatures, mythical Isle of Colossus, and performances that are perfectly pitched to evoke the heightened reality of a fairy tale. And of course, it benefits from that gorgeous score by Bernard Herrmann, one of his best. Eye of the Tiger mostly suffers in comparison, I think, to those two earlier Sinbad films. It feels clunky where those other films, especially Seventh Voyage, are elegant. The acting is all over the map without a consistent tone, with some actors going way over the top and other actors being, shall we say, a bit wooden. The look of the film is a kind of a grimy, mid-70s grainy, kind of looking a lot like a Disney movie of that era, kind of a Freaky Friday kind of look. Not much better than a TV movie of the era. Certainly not the gorgeous, saturated color photography of the first two Sinbad films. Also, the plot is virtually a blow-by-blow remake of Golden Voyage. Let's see, we've got a disfigured prince trying to win back his rightful place on the throne, a burned dude in Golden Voyage, a prince turned baboon by evil spell and tiger, who then enlists Sinbad's help to beat an evil magician bent on getting the throne for himself. Both films are basically a chase, with Sinbad trying to get to a mythical land with magical properties before the evil wizard does. Each evil wizard has an obsequious assistant. Both wizards are disfigured by their use of evil power. The wizard is aged by his spells in Golden Voyage. Zenobia miscalculates the amount of magic juice needed to turn her back from a seagull in one of the film's most deliriously over-the-top scenes, and she winds up with a goofy bird's foot as she cries out, "Not enough! Not enough!" Both films wind up in a climactic battle in a mythical temple that is the source of rejuvenating power that they've been searching for, with a climactic clash between good and evil creatures that have a kind of proxy battle for the human characters. Both films have the good creature losing and the bad creature has to be taken on by Sinbad. And both films end with the prince's deformity magically repaired and he returns to his rightful place on the throne, while Sinbad makes off with the princess. And both films even feature the villain's eyes doing a creepy freeze-frame thing. That's a lot of similarities. In Eye of the Tiger's favor is a much better climax than Golden Voyage's. The location of the Shrine of the Aramesbai is much cooler, with its glowing cone of power, its brass cage on a chain that has to be passed through the cone, with the prince sitting inside to be restored. The battle between the two creatures makes more sense in Eye of the Tiger. In Golden Voyage, it's kind of arbitrary. There's this centaur that just happens to be wandering around the caves who's already grabbed the princess at some point. And then when the climactic battle goes down, out of nowhere, this griffin just comes out of a cave in time for the climactic battle, representing the good creature that has to fight the evil centaur. So it's just kind of arbitrary. It's still a cool fight, though. But Tiger improves on the formula by making the good creature a troglodyte, basically a big caveman dude with a horn, a character that the heroes earlier meet and befriend. So he's a pal and part of Team Sinbad and has already helped them out, and he's buds with the increasingly savage prince turned baboon, so there are some actual stakes when he comes in at the end to do battle with the eponymous tiger. And the tiger as the rep of evil makes more sense, as it's a frozen fossil that the evil Zenobia possesses and brings to life to unleash her fury after her son, who she has been angling to get on the throne in the legit prince's place, gets killed in a tussle with the baboon. So the final battle does feel a little more grounded in the plot and has some real stakes. And we feel for Trog when he finally bites the dust at the teeth and claws of the saber-toothed tiger. And it makes it more dramatic afterwards when Sinbad has to face off all alone against the tiger. As far as the animation goes, I think it's solid in Eye of the Tiger. I think there's actually a lot more animation in this film than in some of Harryhausen's other films. And something that I really like about it is I think you can feel Harryhausen pushing himself and trying new things in this movie. Aside from the goblin creatures that Sinbad has to fight at the beginning of the film and Zenobia's pet Minotaur, All the creatures are either real animals, baboon, wasp, walrus, saber-toothed tiger, or realistic if made up, Trog. And Harryhausen is really going for more character development in his animation here. Two of the animated creatures are true characters in the film, with a lot of screen time and interaction with the human cast, and features some of Harryhausen's most subtle animated performance work. The baboon is a major character, featured in most of the film, and the animation is really good and refined. The creature does some real acting, going through a range of emotions from grief and annoyance to outbursts of rage as he slowly devolves into an actual ape. The interaction between the baboon and the human actors is quite good, especially as scenes with Jane Seymour, such as when they are playing chess. Likewise, Trog is a real character, and like the baboon, he is given an arc to play. First menacing as he encounters our band of heroes, then hesitatingly accepting them, and then finally sacrificing his life for them. Both these characters are among Harryhausen's finest work, honestly. Something which is probably an annoyance for some, but actually works for me, is the film has a kind of a loose, goofy charm about it, which I find rather appealing. The cast, as I've mentioned, is kind of all over the map in terms of what they do, with some being rather wooden and some going way over the top. For me, I think the MVP in the cast is Margaret Whiting as the evil Queen Zenobia, who is just deliriously over the top in this film, with her constant cries of "Minotaur!" or "Not enough! Not enough!"
Not enough. Not enough.
When she doesn't have enough magic juice to turn back from a seagull and gets the goofy bird foot. She is a hoot throughout and actually kind of makes the movie for me.
Kill the queen!
Kurt Christian as her son Raffi doesn't fare as well here, as he just kind of gets to play furtive and weird. He was actually in Golden Voyage of Sinbad as the hashish-smoking roustabout Haroun, who Sinbad gets saddled with, and who eventually grows into a full-fledged seaman, as he proclaims himself at the end. His character in that earlier film is a whole lot of fun, is actually a highlight of the live-action portion of the film for me. Unfortunately, he doesn't get to have any fun in Tiger. More fun is Patrick Troughton as Melanthius, the sorcerer Team Sinbad recruits to help them in their quest. He's not as much fun as Whiting, but he does give some rather spectacularly goofy line readings and gets some of the best laughs when he confronts the tiny Zenobia after she's transformed herself with her magic juice to spy on her opposition.
You tell me, when will you decide to return to your proper shape and size, and how? Something of unique power. A power that might be used to return Prince Cassim to his human form and make our journey to the shrine of the Arimaspai unnecessary.
The Arimaspai! Ha ha!
Where is it? And in what form? A liquid? A powder?
My locket! Gone!
You've dropped it, haven't you? Now where would it be?
He makes many such blunders in his confrontation with evil. Funny coincidence here, as he is the second Doctor Who to appear in a Sinbad film, following Tom Baker in Golden Voyage. Patrick Wayne as Sinbad is certainly the least of the three to play the character in the trilogy, following the excellent Kerwin Matthews and the kind of goofy but fun John Philip Law. All the same, I like him all right. He has a clunky kind of charm, and he has that magnificent mane of hair that makes him look like a rogue Bee Gee. Jane Seymour is not as good here as she was earlier in Live and Let Die, nor would be later on in Somewhere in Time, but man oh man does she look terrific. The score by Roy Budd is nice. It doesn't come close to the magnificent score by Bernard Herrmann for Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, but few scores do. I mean, it's one of the great scores by one of the great composers to ever score a film. So that is a pretty high bar. The score here suits the material. It's got a nice sweeping main theme. It's particularly effective, I think, in the action scenes with some really cool propulsive elements, that fuel some of the fights, especially the last fight between Sinbad and the eponymous Eye of the Tiger. I had to look Roy Budd up because I didn't really know anything about him other than he scored this film. I found that he was actually a jazz pianist, scored a ton of movies, including the excellent Get Carter, but unfortunately he died really young at the age of 47. Director Sam Wanamaker was an interesting fellow who, despite distinguished service in the U.S. Army in World War II, because of his communist views, spent many years in England as an actor and director to avoid the McCarthy witch hunt and blacklist. He is most famous for leading the effort to recreate Shakespeare's Globe Theatre on its original site in London, which he was shocked to discover was the site of an abandoned brewery, with only an old, forgotten plaque commemorating it as the one-time site of the Globe. Something else of note, The Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger marked the film debut of actor Peter Mayhew, who played the live-action version of the Minotaur, rowing the boat. And he actually had a much more famous part earlier in that summer when he played Chewbacca, the Wookiee. His part as the Minotaur was actually shot before he did Star Wars and was his big screen debut, though he is uncredited in the film. The film was shot between June and October of 1975, whereas Star Wars was shot the next year in 76. The reason for that big gulf in the shooting times was the sheer amount of time it took Harryhausen, working alone, to complete all the special effects shots for the film. Harryhausen took from October of 75 to March of 77 to complete the many diorama shots. Meanwhile, Star Wars had a much tighter schedule to complete its many groundbreaking effect shots, leading to a lot of stress, chaos, and conflict between Lucas and the brand new industrial light magic that Lucas had created explicitly to do the effects for Star Wars. Another factor in the timing is the fact that Harryhausen couldn't begin work on the FX until principal photography was done. Harryhausen's method, which was dubbed Dynamation when Seventh Voyage of Sinbad was made, and had been changed to Dinorama in the years between, involved rear projecting the live-action elements onto stop-motion sets, frame by frame, as Harryhausen animated his menagerie of creatures. It was a painstaking, time-consuming, technical process which Ray toiled away at in his little home animation studio alone, with no assistance, at least not until his next and final film, Clash of the Titans, which, due to the scale and schedule, necessitated him taking on helpers for the first time. Ray preferred to work alone. Indeed, it was almost a necessity, as the process was so painstaking and required such a high level of concentration, as he would work hours and hours to get just a few seconds of animation, that any distractions could be disastrous. In those days, of course, there was no such thing as the video playback they have for stop-motion animators now, so they can see where they were in the middle of a shot if something breaks their concentration. But in those days, the animation was being captured on film that had to be developed, so there was no way for Ray to go back and check his work in the middle of a shot if he forgot where he was. And if something like that happened, he would have to scrap the shot and start all over again. As mentioned earlier, I got to see the Cyclops skeleton. Actually, I got to see a whole lot more than that at the Ray Harryhausen Mythical Menagerie exhibit at the Oklahoma Science Museum in 2017, which was a true highlight of my life. It was such an incredible thrill to see so many of the original puppets, armatures, storyboards, and concept art from Ray's mythology films, many of which were screen used. I have a not very good video posted of it here on the channel, which ironically has become our biggest hit with something like 80,000 views. I never intended that to happen. The video is probably our worst on the whole channel and was just a quick assembly edit of all the footage so my family out of town could get a look at the exhibit. I always meant to go back and edit a better version later, but other projects got in the way. Also, I'm not happy with the footage I got. We had just gotten our first HD camera, the Canon Rebel, and I was still not comfortable shooting with it. See, for most of my life, about 40 years, I'd been shooting with cameras first like this, like the Super 8 camera, where it would be like this, And then later on, I graduated up to full-size VHS and Super VHS camcorders, which were monsters, 40-pound monsters that sat on my shoulder. And once again, had an eyepiece you held up to your eye. And then after that, I graduated to 3-chip mini DV cameras like this one, which again, shot like this. And the kind of shooting that I do that you almost have to do when you're working with zero budget and very little time, it's almost all handheld. You're running and gunning, trying to get shots just as fast as you can. And so I was very used to shooting like this with a stable point of contact on the camera. And we had just gotten the Canon Rebel, our first HD camera, right not too long before that Harryhausen exhibit, and I still wasn't used to shooting with it. In particular, because this one's got a screen like the DSLR cameras do, because the Canon camera doesn't have a viewfinder you can use. You have to use the thing, and so you have to shoot out like this, and I just was not used to it. And as a consequence, my camera work sucked badly. As many of the commenters on the video have pointed out helpfully. Fortunately, most of them were much nicer comments. Most of the comments were actually really nice. A few people griped about the camera work. I admit the camera work sucked. I've gotten much better since with that camera. But boy, it took forever to get used to shooting this way. Holding it out, looking at the screen. Add to that my utter excitement of just going out of my brain, seeing all this stuff. I didn't shoot good footage with it. So by contrast, my wife, who is a much better photographer, especially still photography, than I am, and she had already mastered still photography with the Canon, especially with the 40mm prime lens. So most of the images, Oh, my wife, Ever the Pro, is correcting me. It's a 50mm prime lens. So yes, I'm sorry. See, I don't know what I'm talking about, clearly. It's a 50mm prime lens. But most of these shots, like these here, most of the still shots that you're seeing here, like this one of Trog, which my wife took of the actual miniature. You see, this is the actual one Harryhausen is sitting here with. Isn't that cool? I mean, that's just fucking cool. Isn't that cool? It's Ray Harryhausen is actually sitting there with the puppet that he animated in the film that was sitting right there in a glass case 6 inches from our faces that my wife took this beautiful picture of. Same thing with the tiger here. In fact, on the tiger, it's cool. You could still see on his, you don't see it here, but you can see on his back leg, and I'll include a shot of this in the footage that you'll be seeing on this. You can see the red dye where his leg was cut. And at one point, Sinbad slashes his leg, and he's got a bit of blood from the leg, and you can actually still see the pink remains of the dye that they used on the fur to simulate that Harryhausen used to simulate the blood. That's how cool it was, and how hands-on you were looking at the stuff there. But yeah, the best shots that you're seeing here are from my wife, Margaret, much more talented than me. The only still frame that you're getting from me, which is one that I actually am proud of, is the one of Ray Harryhausen in the background in front of, it was a picture of him. He wasn't there. There was a picture of him in front of a brass statue that he had sculpted of the Cyclops. And that's my only contribution still frame wise. But yeah, I'll be showing a lot of these shots, especially from, we're focusing on the display case that had all the Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger stuff. But it's been my intention all these years to go back and make videos showcasing the footage and the still pictures in a much better light. And this is the first video of that. So we'll be doing some more as time goes on. I think I'll do one for each film. Golden Voyage of Sinbad, Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, Jason the Argonauts, Clash of the Titans, so that I'll talk about the film and show the really cool pictures and images and things that we got from the Harryhausen exhibit, which was just truly a great experience and one of the most awesome things to happen in Oklahoma, I gotta say. Now, I have seen Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger countless times. Saw in the theater, of course, just endlessly on HBO. It played a lot on HBO in the day. And then, of course, in the advent of home video, I got it. And in fact, I've double, triple, and quadruple dipped the Sinbad films. First was on VHS. My parents got me this for Christmas in the mid '90s, I believe. Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger, right here. Oh, hey, that's cool. And it never got. It didn't. I was not kind and did not rewind last time I watched this. Who knows when that was? I mean, that may have been 30 years ago, or 20. And then of course DVD kicked in, and you had DVD Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger, which I got there. Got it on Twilight time when Blu-ray kicked in. The latest and the greatest, however, is this really beautiful box set from Indicator, a British outfit that we just recently got. So we just recently watched all 3 Sinbad films on this new set, and it's a really beautifully put together box set with nice art and everything. There's the Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger with the theatrical poster on the front there, and the films through Indicator did a 4K restoration of Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, and even though it's not 4K here in this release, it's an HD Blu-ray. It does make a difference, in the transfer when you see it, and it is a marked improvement over the previous Blu-ray. It really looks gorgeous. Seventh Voyage. This was worth some $60 odd for this limited edition box set, I think, which we paid, which was, I don't know what it was in pounds, but it was something, because we actually had to order it from England, jolly old England. Golden Voyage, and so that is Seventh Voyage is worth the price of admission alone, I think, because it's such a gorgeous transfer, and it's so much better looking than the previous Blu-ray. They only did 2K remasters on Golden Voyage and Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger, but it's a better presentation. And in fact, I think Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger honestly probably looks about as good as it ever could, given its grainy sort of 70s TV movie quality photography. But it's nice. The presentation is good. Most importantly, the stop motion looks fine. It's nice and detailed. There is some softness because of the elements used and the nature of the Dynorama process, where you're rephotographing elements. So there is some softness in a higher resolution format, but I think it looks fine. There is a little bit of wonky blue screen work in this one, which a lot of people really harp on about when you read reviews of it. It's not really that bad or that distracting to me. And honestly, some of the work is amongst Ray Harryhausen's best in terms of the Dynorama process shots, particularly when you're talking about the baboon and Trog interacting with the humans. There's some really good stuff. There's really good integration there. And of course, the animation with the baboon and Trog is some of Harryhausen's most subtle. But yeah, and it's also got some really great extra features, got some new interviews and things, got an isolated 5.1 score for all 3 films, which is really cool. It's got some new stuff, like it's got a feature-length Q&A session with Harryhausen that's presented as a commentary track on the film, which is cool. And I've listened to about half of that on Eye of the Tiger. So there's 3 of them. There's one on each of the films. But it's a great set. And as those of us who collect physical media like about it, it's not just how good it looks and sounds, which on a good presentation is better than you can get streaming, honestly. But it's also about the physical artifact and having something that you can hold in your hand that's neat. You can have my physical media when you pry it out of my cold, dead fingers. And this one it's a really neat look. It's really great design. And check this out. This is pretty funny here. And check it out. They got stuff on the inside here that I think is original promotional material. Swords, sorcery, Sinbad. And it's got the catchphrase of "Hold that tiger!" Not the greatest catchphrase of all time or tagline of all time, but Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger. Hold that tiger! Which is an odd tagline, to be sure. But also kind of goofy and charming, like the film itself. Sinbad in the Eye of the Tiger is one of those magical childhood films that end up being more than the sum of its parts for me. I will always have a special connection with it, not only because it's a film by one of my idols, Ray Harryhausen, but it's also the film I credit with making me a filmmaker, such as I am. And it also happens to be a goofy, old-fashioned, swashbuckling adventure movie with some of the most refined work by the greatest special effects artist of all time, Mr. Ray Harryhausen. So, not a bad time at the movies. Until next time, you have been geeking out with Galaxy Infinitum. Gonzo's fascinated by my super shorts. Are you geeking out, Gonzo? Is Gonzo geeking out? Gonzo's geeking out too. Gonzo geeks out all the time. Gonzo is in a constant geek out state, aren't you, Gonzo?